Good morning, friends. Good morning. Good to see you here this morning at church. Beautiful day outside, beautiful people inside. And we are excited about what God is going to say to us, how He's going to speak to us this morning. If you have been coming to Crossbridge Church, you know that this is the last sermon of the Forward Living series. We've been going through the series in the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua is the sixth book of the Bible. It's the book that follows the five first books written by Moses. Joshua is Moses' successor. God calls Joshua to give continuity to Moses' ministry. Moses delivered the people out of Egypt, where they had been in captivity for 400 years, so that God would take them to the promised land, to this place that God had promised them, where they would be able to flourish as a people and as a nation. And they wandered around in the desert. I mean, they could have gotten there really like in a week, but they wandered around the desert. They were walking in circles because of their inability to follow God's clear command to do things. And so what should have taken them a few days ended up taking them 40 years. Now, Moses dies right before the people of God get into the promised land. And now, the leader that's supposed to take the people into that promised land is this man by the name of Joshua. And in Joshua's calling and Joshua's ministry is all about moving forward, never moving back, never moving sideways. Like the people had moved in the desert, they moved in circles, they moved sideways. Joshua's command from God, his calling involved always moving forward. So that's what he is doing here. And he gets into the promised land, and to his surprise, people are not rolling the red carpet for them to come in and take over the land. They have to take the land. It's a matter of fights and battles that they have to wage. And they spent 7 years doing that. They're waging battles and they're fighting wars. And every time that they disregard God's instruction, they lose. There's a lesson learned, and then there's an opportunity always to move forward. They spent 7 years, but they finally conquer the land. And the passage that we're going to read from today is right at the end of the book of Joshua, right from chapter 24. We're fast forwarding all the way to the last chapter. And this is 20 years after they first got into the promised land. So 20 years later, this is where this passage that we're going to read finds itself. This is the context of it. They had already taken a hold of the promised land. Joshua is very old. The text tells us he's 110 years old. 110 years old. And he stands in front of this people that he had led all these years. About 27 years he had led these people, right? And he gives his last speech. He leaves them with a last word. Every last word that someone leaves you is usually the summary of it all. It's the most important word. If you think about Jesus' last words before he died on the cross, it is finished. That is a very important word for us here today, that we don't have to work for our salvation anymore, because Jesus said before he died, his last words were, "It is finished." And before Jesus ascended into heaven, before he left his disciples, his last words to the disciples were, "Go into all of the world and make disciples of all nations." That's the summary of the Christian life, is that you are forgiven and you are called to proclaim the gospel. These are Jesus' last words. And now here we have Joshua's last words, the summary of it all. After all those years leading the people of God, before he dies, this is what he says. You want to find out? Turn with me to Joshua 24. And we're going to read just 2 verses right now. I'll refer back to the rest of the chapter. If you want more details, go back to the chapter and read the rest of the chapter. But these are his last words in verses 14 and 15, okay? Last words. Now, therefore. So, by the way, every time in the Bible that there's a therefore, you have to ask, what is that for? What is there for? And the idea is it's an application of a whole body of teaching. This is the practical stuff, right? Therefore, this is the application. Now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods of your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose lands you dwell. But as for me, speaking for himself now, as for me and my house will serve the Lord. This is the word of the Lord. Me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So as we unpack his last sermon and his last words to the people, well, let's think about what these words that are written here in the pages of Scripture are all about. What is the last sermon of Joshua about? It's about the need to serve. It has to do with the question of service. He asks the question of service. And it's also about the strength to serve. We're going to look at all these three things today: the need to serve, the question of service, and the strength to serve. First, the need to serve. What is the main topic? What is one word that summarizes his last words to the people? What is one word that summarizes his sermon? Every time that I'm prepping for a sermon, I don't know if you guys knew this, I actually do prep for a sermon. I don't shoot off my hip when I get up here. You see notes here. And I'm always thinking, this is where I start. What is one word that summarizes everything that I must communicate on Sunday when I read a text? What is one word that summarizes everything? That's what I do. And therefore, when you look at this sermon of Joshua, in the last chapter of this book, you have to ask that question. What is one word that summarizes his sermon to the people? And that's the word service. And what Joshua wants the people to do is to live a life of service. Yeah, he talks here about serve the Lord, but a life that's lived in service of the Lord is a life that's lived in service of people. Live a life of service. Don't do anything else besides living a life of service. Because he knows that the temptation now going forward, they have taken over the land, like I said in the beginning of the sermon. The land is laid out before them. And one thing that he does now is he subdivides the land into lots and gives each piece of the land to one of the tribes of Israel. There are 12 tribes, and everyone is allotted a piece of land. And he subdivides it, says, your tribe, tribe of Dan, is supposed to stay here, and these are the delineations for you, the tribe of Benjamin, and these are the delineations for you, the tribe of Judah, and so forth and so on. He delineates the land. And he's saying this to them. He said, now there's two main issues here. One issue is that you have pagan people, Amorites, that are still living with you in the land that God has given you. You're inhabiting this land, and this land is also inhabited by pagan people. The second thing is that the way in which you will hold this together into the future for the generations, for your children, is by staying together. And I know you guys are going to live in each of your own corners of the land and each of the lots that have been allotted to you, but the way in which you're going to keep this together for the future is by sticking together as a people. He knew of the tendency that every single one of them would have towards assimilation to the pagan culture that was in their midst, to not hold tight to the teachings of the Word of God, to the principles and the terms of the covenant that God had made with them. He knew it would be hard, as it is for you and I today. It's very hard, I know, for you Christians to hold tight to the values of the kingdom of Christ. It's very hard for you to hold tight to the teachings and the principles of Jesus as you go about living your life with work and, living your life with people that do not hold the same beliefs that you do. Every once in a while, we catch ourselves running after the things that everyone is running after. and valuing the things that everyone around us is valuing. Instead of valuing the values of the kingdom, we end up valuing things like career and money and significance and achievement. And so Joshua knows that the only way that they will not assimilate into the pagan culture that's around them is holding tight to the teachings of Scripture. And he knows that the only way that they will be together and that this will survive generations is if they live for one another and they forfeit the temptation to live individualistic lives. Because he knew that as time would go on, that the temptation would be for every tribe to look after their own interests and not the interests of the whole. That's always a temptation. For you to run after your own plans and after your own dreams, because that is what our culture encourages us to do. Don't worry about your parents. Don't worry about your community. Don't worry about your faith community. Don't worry about what they think and say. You run after your own dreams and your ideals and forget about everyone else. And while there is some nobility to that calling to pursue, our dreams and our careers, I'm not saying that you should not, but you should not ignore what that pursuit may do to the community around you. And I think that's important because, there are some husbands and some wives that only think about their careers and they don't think about the impact of that pursuit to their own families. And some of you are business leaders and you're wanting your business to grow, but at what cost? You're not thinking about the impact of that to your neighborhoods and to people that live in the southern hemisphere, for instance. We're not thinking about the impact of our pursuits. And Joshua wants to make sure that as they go about living life in this new place, that they're not only conscientious of not being assimilated into that culture, but that they would stick together as a nation and not individual small nations, 12 little nations, but one nation subdivided into 12 tribes. It's important that as you become part of this church, as you become part of this church community, that you're not only thinking about your own interests. Even in the church, there's that type of individualism that we have inherited from the culture around us. Because we have assimilated, we have brought that into the church. And whenever we come into the church, the question always for us is, and I'm a pastor, I see this a lot, it's like, how can this church serve me? I have all these needs. Are you going to serve all my needs? And again, there's nothing wrong for you to ask this question, and we want to serve all your needs. Just be clear here. But a bigger question is, how can I take that which God has deposited in me, whether it's my life story, the gifts, the talents, the time that He has given me, so that I can serve the whole? Because at the end of the day, listen, narcissism is not good for communities. It does not build societies and communities. And that does not build you as a person. It destroys both. And some of you know people that have destroyed their lives because of their radical narcissism. And they have destroyed the companies, and they have destroyed the neighborhoods and the families and their marriages because all they think is themselves. And Joshua wants people to think beyond themselves. He says, these are my last words to you. My last words to you. I'm gonna kick the bucket. I'm about to kick the bucket. I'm 110 years old. Last words to you is serve. Serve. For you here today, what is God saying to you? Serve. Serve. You know why? Because no one can live a life of true significance without service. You cannot find meaning and significance in life unless you live your life for something greater than yourself, unless you live your life for others. And that's why Jesus, when He came and He started His public ministry, He would say things like, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but the Son of Man has come to serve. And He would say things also like, it is better to give than to receive. Because no one can find true joy and meaning and significance in life unless they are living their lives to serve someone else. Is that the reality of your life? Or you have adopted the narcissistic sermons of our culture and you are living your life by them? All you think is yourself. You're completely focused and honed in on yourself. And that's why here at Crossbridge, we want to develop a culture of service. And all of the people that are part of this church, I don't want to be just a provider of goods for you guys. I don't want you guys just to be consumer of goods, of our programs, our ministries, and the word that we share with you every Sunday, and the music that is played from up here on stage, and the counseling services that we make available to you. We want you to move from consumers to providers. That's what Joshua is encouraging them. He says, don't live a life of a consumer. Be a provider. So that's why here at Crossbridge we say this, okay? If you're too good to serve, you're not good enough to lead, right? If you're too good to serve, you are not good enough to lead. And in fact, you can apply that in every context. If all you want is for people to serve you, you're not a good leader. In marriage, in your household, your kids, if you don't adopt the mentality of service, you're not good enough to lead. You're not worth following. Now, let me, because I have time here today, I'm staying here in KB, I'm gonna drive this a little deeper in terms of application. How do we serve? How do we serve the people that are closest to us? How do we serve? Well, first of all, look at what Joshua says here. But as for me and my house, I will serve the Lord. The best way you can serve the people that are close to you, which I assume is your family, is to serve the Lord. And if you are a parent, to nurture your kids in the ways of the Lord. That's the best way you can serve your kids. The greatest disservice that you can do from your kids to your kids is to neglect that responsibility. I'm so glad that my mom would not let me, when I would wake up on Sunday mornings and say, I'm just too tired. I was, playing video games all night. I'm going to stay home. She says, no, you go to church. Go to church. And, sometimes when I would fail to wake up, she would, for the third time walk into the room, she would throw like a cup of water on me. Like oh, crap. You got to go to church. Doesn't matter. Like when you turn 18, you leave my house, it's no problem. But you have to be at church. It is our responsibility. You cannot let your kids govern you, okay? Let me tell you that. You have to take on the responsibility of being the spiritual leader of your household, mom and dad. The reason why the people were wandering in the wilderness is because they failed to teach it to the following generations. And so the greatest way you can serve your spouse is to be Jesus to them. The greatest way that you can serve your kids is not to allow them to pick their own path and whatever they want to do in life, because that's the narrative nowadays. Affirm them in all of their rebellion. See, let me tell you, kids are lousy leaders. Let me tell you. They're lovely, they're awesome. I have 4 kids, okay? Maybe we would have had more if God had allowed. I have 4 kids. Now, my wife is here, Beth, she'll tell you that. But they're lousy leaders. If you follow them, it's a disaster. Which leads us to the second point of the sermon, which is the question of service. What is the question of service? And Joshua's asking them point blank, who will you serve? Now, I want you to understand that there's a few assumptions as he asks this question. The first one is that you are always serving something or someone. Who will you serve? It's all a matter of choice, but you are always serving someone. Like Bob Dylan wrote the song, "You Got to Serve Somebody." That's true. We're always serving something or someone. And what Joshua wants them to realize is that they need to be conscientious of their choice, because most of the times we're not conscientious of the choices that we are making. In fact, most of our actions are affected by a choice we make that is subconscious. And here's science to prove. The average adult I looked this up, and you can look it up too if you don't believe me. I know everybody now Googles nowadays whatever a preacher says. It used to be the days that they would fully trust the word of a preacher. But there's a lot of not so good preachers out there, so you do right in Googling sometimes. Not every time, but sometimes. But the average adult makes 3,500 decisions a day. Okay, look it up. I'm not lying. Only 120 of those choices are informed choices. But the rest are all uninformed. And I think that when it comes to our spiritual life, this is what is happening, going on here. And that's why it's so important for Joshua to ask them this question. It says, what choices are you making? Do you know what choices are you making? The conscious choices and the subconscious choices. Most of them are subconscious choices, by the way. Like most of us, think about this. We eat things that we're not thinking about the impact of that food in our bodies. Like most of us, come on. Like when you go, when you walk outside, there's going to be some food there. You're not going to be like, what is this going to do to my body? You're not thinking about that, right? Because you're just hanging out and just food, and you just put it in your mouth. We're trying to get healthier foods out there. Pick the carrots, all right? That's all I'll say to you. But most of the time, we are not thinking about what we're eating and what we're saying to people. Think about that. And sometimes, that happens to me. I mean, I'm in an environment, my wife is there, and, I'm just having conversations with people, and I'm thinking I'm crushing it, and then I'm driving back home. She's like, did you realize all that you said, the words that you chose? Like, no, it's all great. No, we're not, We don't think through things. And again, when it comes to our spirituality, the same way as well. See, the choices that we make on an everyday basis is affecting every area of your life, and especially the way in which you conduct your relationship with God. And I'll say more. The reason why you make those choices is an indication of your relationship with God, or the quality of your relationship with God. And Joshua is wanting them to think. Are you conscientious of the choices that you will be making? And it's going to be hard because you have pagans in the land. You're going to try to fight for your own tribe's interest. Are you aware of the choices that you are making, that you will be making? The point that he's making here is this, is that if you're not serving God, you are serving a God. Because everyone serves, like Bob Dylan says. There's a Christian writer by the name of Becky Pippert, and she talks about that. She's one of my favorite writers. This is what Becky said. Here's a quote by Becky Pippert. She says, "Whatever controls us is our Lord. The person who seeks power is controlled by power. The person who lives for the acceptance of others is controlled by the people he or she seeks to please. One thing is certain, we do not control ourselves. We're controlled by the Lord of our lives. Those 3,500 choices that you are making on an everyday basis, as an average, is controlled by the Lord of your life. Who is, here's the tough question, who is the Lord of your life? If I ask you right now, raise your hand if Jesus is the Lord of your life. Most of you, I would imagine, but you're not conscientious even of that response. Because you have to go deeper in order to really identify who is your true master and Lord. And while you raise your hand, your spouse maybe next to you said, that's a lie. I know for a fact that your work is your Lord. I know that. Or your money is your Lord. Or your image is your Lord. People here, they see it better than you sometimes because you're not self-aware. So who's your God? Because you either serve God or some other small g God or a God. And here's a clue to get to the bottom of it all. Do you want to know how to get to the bottom of it all? All right, I'm going to give you an exercise here. There's something you can do. In the book of Deuteronomy, which is the book that Moses wrote before Joshua came into the scene. This is part of the whole law of God, of how you should relate to God. How should a human being relate to God? This is what Moses says in the book of Deuteronomy, right? Chapter 6 says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your strength. So how should one relate to God? By loving him. How? Your heart, not half of your heart, all of your mind, not just half of your mind or parts of your mind, but also with all of your strength. Your God, the answer to that question that I asked, your God is whoever has all of your heart, all of your mind, and all of your strength. So let's get to the bottom of it. Still, start narrowing it down. Your heart. What controls your mood? What makes you happy or unhappy? Is it the stock market? When it goes well, you're like, oh, happy, you're generous to everyone. And it goes down, you're like the grumpiest person, mean to everybody. Oh, there's a clue right there. If it's your image, when you step onto that scale and it's like 10 pounds heavier, and you start getting angry at people, oh, here's a clue. Here's a clue. Here's a clue. If it's your kids, when your kids perform well in school, you're like, oh, so happy. When they start failing, it affects your mood. You're like, oh, okay, here's a clue. All right? Can you feel me? Who takes all of your heart? Now let's move on. Your mind, your thought life. What occupies most of your thought life when you're sitting there in the red light? Under the red light. Where's your mind going? Why is it that you cannot go to sleep? Your mind is inundated by what? When you wake up in the morning, what's the first thought of the day for you? That's a clue of who has all of your mind. Whoever governs your thought life is your God. Is it God? The God of the Bible? You wake up singing praises to him, and today, God, I want to live a life of meaning and significance for you. Put people in my path, open opportunities for me. Is that the prayer that you pray? Or you're like, I can't, I have to do that presentation. Oh my gosh, it's like every day is like that. Oh, that person's coming out to get me. I need to do something, I have to protect my territory here, What's taking over your thought life? And then, with all your strength, what takes more of your time, your effort? That's your God. That's your God. If you're working 90 hours a week, 100 hours a week, maybe you have to because, maybe you're starting a business, but it can't be the norm for your whole life. If you don't need to be working 100 hours a week or 80 hours a week, and you are, and when you come home, you're dead to your spouse and your kids, you're so tired, exhausted. And on Sundays, you don't have energy to come to church. I'm going to stop right here. Otherwise, it's going to get too close to home for some of you. Too close to home. Oh, I'm going to stay home. I'm so tired this week. I worked so hard. Okay, all of your strength. Where's the majority of your strength going? That's a clue. And I hope that by now you acknowledge, like I do, that we're all in trouble here. Okay? We don't get this right 100%. You know why? Because this is embedded into our sinful hearts. And you got to fight against this. That's why he needs to preach this sermon. I'm listening to this sermon here. Yes, common sense. Why you have to say all of this? This is all common sense. It's common sense, but it's really hard for us because this is embedded into our sinful nature. That's why he has to say it. Because your nature, your sinful nature, does everything in its power to run away from God, to cling into other sources of meaning and significance, to build your identity around something else other than God, to live for yourself and not live for others and not live for God. So that's why he has to be this clear and say all these words that are common sense. That's nothing new to you when you walked in here today. This is not anything that you're learning for the first time, that you need to live a life of service. I mean, just business books will tell you that. You just listen to Tony Robbins, he'll tell you that. Or Zig Ziglar, or any of those guys. They'll tell you that. And I'm saying it again, It's common sense, but you don't live this way. I don't live this way, the way we should. Because our nature is curved in on ourselves. And what we must do, therefore, is as we go about answering this question, the first question is, who will we choose? Who are we choosing on a daily basis? That is who your God is. Who are you choosing on a daily basis? And then I think that the way to sort of break out of that unhealthy pattern is to begin to compare the quality of the small g gods that you serve and the God of the Bible that you're called to serve with your heart, with your mind, and with your strength. You begin to compare. Look, I was presented with this quote by this atheist guy. He was a scholar, a man by the name of David Foster Wallace. He was a writer. He wrote many novels. Didn't believe in God, but he acknowledged what we're talking about here. Just for you to see, this is not just something that Christians make up, This is in the minds of even people that are reflective enough to think about the choices that we're making on a daily basis and who we're really worshiping and serving and the effect that has on us. To a group of graduating seniors in college, this is what he says in his speech. And then he killed himself, by the way, for you to know. Because he I don't know if he had just severe mental illness or he just wasn't freed by the power of the gospel. He never surrendered his life to Jesus, but he acknowledged at least the truth. This is what he says, David Foster Wallace. Next one. Thank you, Josh. Here's part of his speech. Because here's something else that's weird but true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there's actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping because everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough and never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally grieve you. So you know what he's tapping into? The quality of the gods that we have surrendered our lives to. And that's why they are small g's. Because every God asks you to do something, to serve them, to sacrifice in their altar. Every God. The God of your work has an altar that you walk up every morning and you walk past every day before you leave it, and it says, what are you going to put in the altar here today in order to be blessed by me? Your kids, they set an altar in your homes. If you don't believe it, it's true. And they say, what are you going to sacrifice here so that I can give you my love and blessing and life? And the thing about these altars that we worship at is that every sacrifice, he's acknowledging this, David Foster Wallace is acknowledging this. Every time we set up a sacrifice, it'll say, thank you, but I want more. It's never enough. Have you noticed that? When you sacrifice in the altar of your career, it's never enough. When you sacrifice in the altar of money, it's never enough. When you sacrifice the altar of image, it's never enough. When you sacrifice the altar of achievement, it's never enough. It's never enough. It's always asking for more. And here's the worst part about it. And David Foster Wallace acknowledges this too. If you fail, it will never forgive you. It will crush you instead. If you fail your kids, they will crush you. If you fail your work, there's no forgiveness there. You'll be crushed by it. Our gods, small g gods, are unforgiving when we fail them. They have no mercy, no grace. They'll run you dry. You'll start looking like Smeagol in The Lord of the Rings. That's a perfect picture of what it looks like, of somebody that has served a ring like a master and Lord. My precious, right? That's what he says. He used to be a beautiful hobbit. Now he's like this horrible creature because his idol, the ring, has crushed him under its weight. And some of you are crushed under the weight of your idols, and you are hopeless and you can't get out. That's why you can't go to sleep. Your heart is filled with resentment and anger and hate towards other people. It's because you have devoted your life to a God that's not a true God. And you need freedom from it. Now, when you compare that with the true God of the Bible, how does the true God of the Bible treat you? He asks you to live your life for Him. And when you fail, He forgives and extends grace to you. And He compels you with His love, which gives us way into the last portion of the sermon, which is the strength to serve, because here's the idea. None of us have enough strength to serve the Lord. Again, I say that our soul, our heart, because of sin, as the reformer Martin Luther used to say, is incurvatus se in Latin. Incurvatus se means curved in on itself. And therefore, in order for you to be set free, you have to unbend the curvature of the soul and of the human heart. The reason why we can't see God in others is because we only see ourselves. How do you unbend that curved heart within its own structures and its own axle? Because it's only when the heart is unbent that you are able to truly live a life of service, which means that you have been delivered from the tyranny of the small gods that you have chosen to serve in your life. How do we do that? It's, again, going back, it's when you compare the goodness of the God that calls you to worship Him compared to the cruelty of the small gods that you have chosen to worship. How do you see the goodness of God? You see what Joshua's doing here? He acknowledges it's going to be hard for them to continue to obey the Lord. But from verses 1 through 13, you can read it later, he reminds them of all of the good things that the Lord has done for them up to that point. It's all been grace. God has been merciful and graceful even in their disobedience. He has been forgiving when they have failed Him. In fact, in verse 13, which is the previous verse, we started with verse 14. In verse 13, he says this is the voice of the Lord speaking to the people. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities that you had not built, and you dwell in them. You eat the fruit of vineyards and olive orchards that you did not plant. Let's look back at our history. And let's see me as a spouse to you. Let's see God as a spouse to the people. And you sometimes have claimed that you're in a horrible relationship with me, but the spouse always at fault is you. And yet I'm still faithful and I still provide for your needs. I give you a house and a land to live that you did not deserve, and I give you the opportunity to eat from fruits that you did not plant. It's all byproduct of my goodness and my grace to you. And I can say that to all of you here today, and I can point at myself and say the same thing. That you live and inhabit places that you did not work for. And you eat from fruits that you did not labor and plant for as well. It's all been the Lord. You say, no, I went to school and I made good decisions. But if God did not give you the opportunities, if God did not give you the health, if God did not allow you to be born in this time and day and age under the family that you were born in, you would have never gotten to where you gotten in life. Never. So don't shake your fist at God and say, I've built all of this and it's all of my deservings, none of yours. You inhabit houses and you eat from vineyards that you did not plant for. And the reason why he's saying this to the people is this. It's not to shame them. It's for them to see how God has served them in comparison to how the gods of the Amorites and the other gods will treat them when they fail them. He said, look, compare. You make a choice today. And this question is postured in front of all of you here today. Who will you serve? Who will dictate the 3,500 decisions that you make a day? The 120 informed decisions that you make on a daily basis? Who will? Who is? There's a choice for you here today. Posture is set before you. Are you going to serve the gods that always asks for more and always crush you when you fail them? Or are you going to serve the God that's always been faithful and loving and forgiving towards you? The only way that you will find power to serve God is when you see Him serving you. I told you last week that Joshua is the same name for Jesus, and Joshua is a prefigure of Jesus. He's a picture of Jesus. And the calling here is to follow our Joshua by example, but not only that, is to see him serving us. See, when Jesus had the opportunity to keep his life and forfeit you, he chose to forfeit his life and keep you. He is the only God that will not ask you to sacrifice on his altar before he sacrifices himself on his own altar for you. See the comparison? All the other gods say, sacrifice for me. Jesus says, I will ask you that, but first I'm going to sacrifice myself for you. He's the only one. And then when you fail him, he will not come crashing down with a hammer, but he will embrace you and love you and forgive you and restore you. And listen, it's to the degree that you see Jesus serving you. You need to see this in your mind's eye. You need to remember this, not just at the mind level, but at the heart level. You need to remember this, of how Jesus served you to the death. He was the one who was dried up for your sakes. The idols ask you to dry yourself up for their sakes. Jesus was dried up for your sakes on the cross. And it's to the degree that you allow this to permeate who you are, that your self-entitlement will be uprooted from your life. And you will experience more and more freedom and more joy and a life of purpose and meaning, because you have discovered the secret of Jesus, which is not to live a life to be served, but a life of service. And you begin to understand, and now it starts to make sense to you, his words, that it's better to give, always better to give than to receive.